So, if any of you missed the talk on Sunday the 19th on Elijah the prophet, or were struggling because the mics weren't so great, I've done a little podcast this morning just on what I spoke about, and really just a catch up for you all. It's interesting because if you read ancient Near Eastern documents, either from Egypt or Mesopotamia, most of the time what you'll get is really, really positive material. In other words, things that praise the most elite in power at the time. The kings, the pharaohs, the Mesopotamian kings. The king is close to the god. The king is great in battle. The king was good for the crops because he was close to the god. The king's reign was wonderful and holy and da-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da. Okay? So you get all this really positive material about the kings. You don't really get negative material because anyone brave enough to write negative material for the kings in Egypt or Mesopotamia basically got taken out, eliminated. You never wrote bad stuff about the kings. If you go to Egypt and you see obelisks with inscriptions on them, you'll see really positive material. You know, this king did that. That was wonderful, etc., etc. His power is all over the kingdom of Egypt or Mesopotamia or whatever. Okay, so you get all this positive material. But the Bible is completely different. And the interesting thing about it, if you read the Old Testament, you know, right from the beginning, or the time of Moses, the kings get positive and negative material. We saw there when we started this series, we saw that Moses confronts King Pharaoh. He challenges King Pharaoh, and we have that documented. If you read the books of 1 and 2 Samuel, you'll see how Samuel confronts King Saul. And there's a lot of negative material about King Saul. If you read the story in the book of 2 Samuel, how Nathan the prophet confronts King David. Even King David, isn't perfect. He was the wonderful hero, the one who defeated Goliath, and we love to put David on a pedestal. But right in the midst of all of that, there's a story of Bathsheba, which is terribly, terribly negative. And Nathan confronts David directly with this little parable. He says, there was a man, it was a farmer who was really poor, and he only had one sheep, and there was a rich farmer next to him, and that rich farmer went and stole the one sheep that he had. What would you want done to that? And David says, well, bring me this man, I will take him out. And Nathan basically points to David and he said, that is you, David. And David's character is just completely decimated in that story. And it's remarkable that story is even there, preserved for us. And the reason we have, all this negative material in the Old Testament is because of the prophets, because the prophets are there to challenge the most elite in power. In our story today, Elijah the prophet turns up and he confronts directly King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. And we're in the year about 950 BC in the book of 1 Kings. And Ahab and Jezebel are, not portrayed very well at all. Jezebel was a Phoenician princess, and she likes to worship this god Baal, this Canaanite god Baal. And King Ahab marries Jezebel and brings her into his kingdom. And of course, she takes over and is leading the people of Israel astray to worship the Canaanite god Baal. Now, if you want to know a little bit about the Canaanite god Baal, he was the god of the storm, the god of rain, the god of the crops, fertility, that sort of thing. So, Baal's a guy who makes things happen agriculturally, and to do with the weather. And of course, but he's a false god, This is more about the most elite wielding political power so that they can bring the people under their control and under their reign. So Elijah shows up, and the first thing he does is he announces that there's going to be 3.5 years of drought in the land of Israel. This is a very, very serious announcement. How dare he turn up? And anyway, he's just a little prophet of God. I mean, he has absolutely no power. Baal is the storm god. He's the god of rain. He's the god that brings fertility to the crops and new life and everything else. So, Baal will defeat anything Elijah says. Obviously, it can't come true. But Elijah says this to the king and queen. And of course, what happens? Exactly as he says, for 3.5 years, Israel is in a season of droughts. And things get really desperate. And Elijah goes into hiding, and basically a price is put on his head. And he runs away and hides in a cave. 3.5 years, everyone's getting desperate. The king and the queen are mad. They want to take Elijah out. People of Israel are really desperate, and they're ready to hear truth, really. They've been led astray for so long, and they're getting so desperate, and Baal hasn't come to their aid. So they are ready to hear truth. And so Elijah turns up after 3.5 years, and he announces a showdown, like a bet. He says, okay, I want you to meet me at Mount Carmel, and we're going to see once and for all who the God is, the one true God, the God of the universe. Remember Israel, the God who created everything. The book of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, the God who created everything, the God who rescued you, Israel, the God who gives you a name, Israel. All of these things are really powerful, and Elijah wants to demonstrate once and for all who the one true God is, and actually discredit Baal completely. So he says, come on, let's meet at Mount Carmel. And we'll meet at Mount Carmel. And why Mount Carmel? Mount Carmel is in northwestern Israel. It's a hill that overlooks the sea. And you think, well, what better stage for the god Baal? If Baal is true and real, then his power will be displayed really dramatically. We'll see a big storm. The storm god Baal. We'll see the storm come in over the sea, and rain will come down, and Elijah's challenges the prophets of Baal. Now, I didn't want to rub it in because of the football, but it looked a little bit like this on the screen. You've got 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah. You've got 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, we are told, 1 Kings 18. And then you've just got one little Elijah. It's a bit like a very, very uneven football match. And you can see that picture on the screen. And so you've got these two prophets, these two parties, and Elijah challenges the 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah to a contest. And we're calling this showdown at Mount Carmel. And this is probably like the modern take, the football take on it. But what it really looked like is what you see here. And you got 2 altars. And an altar, if you're unaware, is a bit like a giant barbecue. Basically, you sacrifice a bull on the top of the altar and to your God. And that's how you appease your God, and how you can bring rain, if you're in a drought. So the people are really desperate. Elijah says to the prophets of Baal, okay, you build an altar to the god Baal. Build it up, and put the bull on top of the altar, and everything. And don't light the altar, okay? Because if Baal is really powerful, and that, Baal will light the altar for you, okay? Great. And they go, yeah, that's a cool contest. That's brilliant. We'll build an altar to Baal. So they build this altar to Baal. And all day long, they start praying to Baal. They dance around the altar, and they call out, they fall, they lie down prostrate. They even, which was customary at the time, they even cut themselves to appease Baal, so that Baal would listen. If you want to, just as a tangent side note, if you want to know more about Baal worship, it has been associated with things like temple prostitution, child sacrifice, that sort of thing. But cutting the body was a common thing that people would do as well. So these prophets of Baal are kind of getting desperate. They've been praying and dancing around the altar all day long. They're cutting themselves. And nothing's really happening to the altar of Baal. And Elijah has got a sense of humor. He's one of the few prophets in the Old Testament who has a sense of humor. And interesting, we see there in 1 Kings 18, if you read, go and read the whole chapter, it's great. And he starts taunting them. He says, well, maybe Baal's asleep. Maybe Baal is on holiday. Maybe he's taking a holiday. Maybe you need to wake him up. Maybe he's not listening. Ha ha ha. Kind of. Where's Baal? I don't. Nothing seems to be happening with your altar. Hardy, hardy, ha. Anyway, so nothing happens. At that point, Elijah, after they've waited a whole day, he calls the people of Israel over to him. And at this point, they really want to listen. They'll listen to anything. Baal's not doing anything for these people. And he rebuilds the altar, and this is quite significant. The altar to the Lord had been torn down. And Elijah rebuilds this altar. And he takes 12 stones, and these 12 stones represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And we see there that what's significant about this altar is that it's a reminder, that who God is. God is the one, as I said, who is creator of the universe and everything. And he created his people in his image. And then he chose Israel. He rescues them out of slavery in Egypt and takes them into the promised land. We saw that when we looked at the story of Moses. And so he rebuilds this altar representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And so that the people will see and remember who the one true God is. And he doesn't like the altar. And he stands around and he does something very interesting. And it's the one thing that you really don't do with a barbecue. Just before he's finished the altar, he digs a trench around the altar, as you can see there in the picture. And then he commands the people to get these big water jugs and just completely pour water over the altar. And he asks them to do this 3 times. 3 times. It's like 3.5 years of drought. Now just pour water on the altar. But you're thinking, well, how's the altar going to light at all? You don't pour water on a barbecue. It's crazy. But this barbecue gets completely and utterly drenched, and water is actually flowing down into the trench that's around, So, there's no human way, basically, that this altar can possibly, just to kind of even the odds a bit with the prophets of Baal. Look, guys, okay, fine. Your altar wouldn't light. I'm going to make it even... I'm gonna make this even harder for God to do. I'm gonna drench this altar with water completely. Okay, so everyone's standing around, and the altar is completely drenched. And then Elijah prays to God, and he prays, "Lord, reveal yourself." Basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, "Reveal yourself, who you really are, the one true God." And he prays to God. And we see there in 1 Kings 18, then the fire of the Lord fell and burnt up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and also licked up all the water in the trench. It's like a bomb crater hit it. I mean, you couldn't, it's just like crazy. It's absolutely crazy how God responded and in such a dramatic way, with fire from heaven. And boom, this whole thing just goes up. And no one in that crowd, not the prophets of Baal, not the people, even the king and queen, would have been amazed. You couldn't deny who the one true God is. And Baal is completely discredited. And then after this, Israel gets rain again. So God then provides rain. And so this is the dramatic story with the showdown at Mount Carmel. But it's really helpful if we're going to really appreciate the story by asking the question, what do we learn about God through the prophet Elijah? And I'm going to I've got like four things here which I want you to just reflect on. The first thing is, I suppose, fairly obvious, and it's what I've been talking about. God cares about how powerful leaders behave. As I said, the kings, the queens, priests, prophets. We saw that, with the prophet Samuel the week before. How the priest was challenged for the behavior of his sons. God cares when kings and queens don't behave the way they should. In other words, they allow injustice to take place, or they lead the people of Israel astray to worship false gods, and they do things which are abhorrent in his kingdom. So he cares, and he will intervene, and we see this. And I find this great because when I reflect on modern times, I long that God would intervene in injustice, and I believe he does, but we don't. It's not always as easy to see. It's not always as dramatic as this. But that's the first one. God cares about how powerful leaders behave. The king, the queen, the prophets of Baal, King Ahab, Queen Jezebel. They got their comeuppance. Unfortunately, if you read on in 1 Kings 18 and 19, it doesn't end well for the prophets of Baal. And later on in the story, it doesn't end well for King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. But secondly, we see there, God is patient with his people. God doesn't just send a lightning bolt from heaven if when his people are led astray. He sends a prophet with 3.5 years of drought. And this gives people time. When God takes people into the wilderness, and we saw this with Moses, he rescues them from Egypt and all the material wealth of Egypt, prosperity and that, and he takes them into the wilderness, and this gives them time to restore their relationship with him, because when they realize that they have nothing, they also realize that all they have is God. So God, this pattern is repeated. God works through hardship. Sometimes he takes us into the wilderness to bring us back to himself. And whatever you're facing at the moment, like I know that some of you are facing really, really, really complex times that I can't solve, that nothing can solve. Nothing can solve. There's no perfect mathematical equation or formula that can solve what you are going through at the moment in your life. But all I can say to you, encourage you, is lean into this pattern that is repeated over and over again. Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days. What does he do? He leans into God. He prays, he fasts. He stops everything. He makes prayer the most important part of his day. And prayer and fasting are things that have happened for centuries. That's what people do. And that come back to God. Come back to God. He is your Savior. Remember, be reminded who he is. And one of the ways that we are reminded who he is, and this is my point number 3, is that God speaks really powerfully in a language that people can understand, with signs and wonders through his creation. This is what we see in point number 3. God is patient, not just patient with his people. He speaks in such a dramatic way, none of them could deny who the one true God was. And that would have given them huge amounts of hope. God doesn't just give them a drought, he brings rain again. He allows them to get desperate. He allows them to hunger for him and a relationship restored to him. And then he brings rain. Okay? After drought comes rain. And he speaks to them from fire from heaven. They are in no confusion who the one true God is. And of course they fall down prostrate and they worship God, not Baal anymore. But this is scary for the king and queen or the elites of the day, because they're losing power. They lose power of the people. That God is more powerful than the kings and the queens. And when all the people saw this, 1 Kings 18:39, they fell prostrate. They cried, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." Okay? And then point number 4, which I think is again worth considering, is just because everyone is doing it doesn't make it right. 850 prophets of Baal and the king and queen, all your leaders, all the people, all the so-called wise people in the kingdom, it doesn't make it right. On the other side, you have one weak little prophet who's hiding in a cave. But God can work powerfully. God doesn't need an army of prophets. God doesn't need a powerful king and queen to operate. God uses weak little Elijah to expose the sin of the people, and they turn back to God. So that's what we learn. What do we learn about God through the prophet Elijah? Those are the 4 things that we can take away. And there'll be other things, but I think those are the four main things. And I want you to hold those 4 things, because we need to ask a second question, and it's part of our series. And the second question is this: what do we learn about Jesus through the prophet Elijah? What do we learn about Jesus? So the first one was, what do we learn about God through the prophet Elijah? And I hope that kind of helps you to understand the character of God in the Old Testament. But secondly, what do we learn about Jesus through the prophet Elijah? Number 1, and like the first point on the previous slide, Jesus cares about how powerful leaders behave. Jesus is always challenging the Pharisees, King Herod, Pontius Pilate. He challenged them against injustice to the people. He challenges them against hypocrisy. He challenges them on unfair laws that they've just added to things. I mean, ultimately, he gets crucified because he challenges and challenges and challenges the leaders of his day. So, just like the character of God, Jesus challenges the leaders of his day. And, I think lots of us are in positions of power, and, ultimately when Jesus, when you encounter Jesus, shall we say, Jesus challenges the sin of our heart, the way we treat other people. The way we are blind to, say, the injustices perpetrated in our own community. He all the time, just as he's challenging his own disciples, he's challenging us, and we need to be sober-minded. We need to be humbled by these challenges of Jesus. And they're completely in line with the way the prophets challenged the most elite in power in their day. So Jesus cared about how powerful leaders behave. But secondly, Jesus is patient with his disciples despite their unbelief, and patient with his people. Jesus stays with his people for three and a half years. Oh, that rings a bell. That sounds familiar. That's like the prophet Elijah's drought. Jesus is patient with his disciples despite their unbelief. In this story about Jesus calming a storm, Jesus orchestrates the whole storm. The disciples have had, in Luke chapter 4, Mark chapter 4, the disciples have had an amazing day of healing and teaching and by the lakeside. And then Jesus says, guys, I think we need to go across to the other side of the lake. And it's, you can see the storm clouds brewing. And if you're a fisherman, you're going, I don't know if that's wise, Jesus. Maybe we should wait till morning. And he's going, no, let's do it. He orchestrates the whole thing, okay? He takes them into the storm. Just as Elijah announced the drought for three and a half years, and the people are then forced into the wilderness so that they might believe. Jesus takes his disciples right into the heart of the storm. And interestingly, he just falls asleep on a cushion in the boat. and again, this is a way of making them desperate, making them understand the urgency of the situation and making them believe. And then Jesus speaks powerfully in a language everyone can understand through signs and wonders in his creation. I find this absolutely remarkable. These guys are fishermen. They understand storm and they understand calm. Now, Elijah builds an altar. He prays to God. He says, God, you're the only person, you're the only one who can do this. And, I'm just the weak little guy here, and he prays to God and fire comes down from heaven. But Jesus is different. In this story, they wake Jesus from sleeping and the disciples are like, Lord, don't you care? Don't you care that, we might drown or whatever, And Jesus just kind of looks at them funny and he's like really chilled out. And he just stands up. He doesn't pray some elaborate long prayer. He doesn't, build some altar on the boat and make, do some elaborate ritual or anything like that. He basically just quietly looks at the storm and goes, be calm. And the storm is calm. And the wind subsides. And the lake goes flat. And there is none of the disciples are in any confusion about who Jesus is. But, having been afraid during the storm, they're now absolutely terrified. And they ask this question, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Do you see how Jesus reflects the prophets of the Old Testament? But he's so much more than the prophets. We are told that he is God in human flesh. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. John 1:14. Amazing. It's like I think this gets. I don't think we talk about this enough. How God speaks through his creation and how Jesus speaks through his creation, over and over again, whether it's feeding the 5,000, whether it's calming the storm, whether it's healing people of diseases that nobody understood at the time. Jesus is completely in control of his creation. He is divine, but he's human, And I do, if I want to extend this point just a little bit further, I do believe that God speaks to us through our creation today. If you look at climate change, if you look at extreme weather, if you look at all these things, I believe it's a reflection of how we have become disconnected from our creation. And I believe that it's a symptom of our own modern day idolatry, the way we just forget creation. The creation belongs to God. And we've forgotten that. We've just believed that the creation belongs to us and we can do with it whatever we like. And I believe that's idolatry. I believe that we need to be re-enchanted by creation because God can speak. In Romans 1, Paul talks about how we are without excuse because God has revealed himself, not only in his word, but also in everything that he has made. Now, I find that a really, really, really powerful argument. And so, we need to open our ears to what is going on in our world today. Everything is connected. Wars ravage the creation. And when we have climate change, we're fortunate enough here, living in Jersey or in the Western world, we just go along to our local Tesco's or Waitrose and buy milk or whatever. The poorest of the poor in the world suffer the most with climate change. Sub-Saharan Africa, these things, And if you love your neighbor, then open your eyes and see that we are completely and utterly disconnected from our creation. But God will speak powerfully through our creation to draw us back to him, to the one true God. And Jesus did exactly like that. Exactly that as well. And he reflects that as well. And so that's so Jesus cares about how powerful leaders behave. Jesus is patient with his disciples despite their unbelief. Jesus speaks powerfully in a language everyone can understand through signs and wonders in his creation. And to fishermen out on the Sea of Galilee, you could not speak in a more direct and clear language. But who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Our fourth point, and it reflects the previous slide, and that is just because everyone is doing it doesn't make it right. Jesus is the ultimate altar and sacrifice that exposes the sin of the world. Remember I said Elijah rebuilds the altar of the Lord. If you remember the story of Jesus cleansing the temple, John 2, Jesus, takes a whip and he runs through and overturns the moneylenders in the temple and everything else. And then, the people come to him. They think, oh, maybe he's a prophet, and they come to him and say, give us a sign. And in John 2, he says to them, specifically says, tear down this temple, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And they think, wow, that'd be a crazy time. The temple took 46 years to build. Wow, blah, 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 blah. And he goes on. But we're told there in John 2 that he's not talking about the temple, as in the bricks and mortar temple. He's talking about his own body. And just as Elijah, rebuilds the broken temple, Jesus returns. He steps into the world to bring a new covenant, to remind folk once again, but in a new way, to expose the sin of the world. And he is the altar. He is the sacrifice. He is the one who is raised up on the cross, and that exposes the sin and the justice of the most powerful leader of the day, but all the people, because all the people gathered around him are shouting, crucify him, etc., etc. So and Christ dies. He is the sacrifice. He dies on the altar. And if you compare Elijah, we see fire from heaven. When Jesus is on the cross, we see this massive earthquake, and Matthew records how rocks are splitting and the sky turns black. And, gosh, if that is not a voice from the creation, if that is not God speaking powerfully through his creation, then I don't know what is, okay? And then, Jesus is raised up on the third day. And people, not just Jews, but Gentiles as well, begin to turn back to the one true God, the God who creates everything, the God who sustains absolutely everything, the God who gave Israel a name, the God who rescues, the God who challenges injustice and stands on the side and is partial to those who are vulnerable and weak in the community. And these are how all these jigsaw puzzles fit together. But keep reading the prophets. The prophets, if you read the Bible through the lens of the prophets, you'll understand the Old Testament much better. But you'll also understand Jesus much better. If you just read the Gospels on your own, it's like, it's like listening to a symphony, but only listening to the climax at the end, okay? In order for a symphony to be really, really powerful, you need to listen to the whole thing. You need to listen to the arrangement of the notes so that, the whole symphony builds and builds and builds to the climax. With the climax on its own, yeah, it's quite good, but it's not the whole symphony. The whole symphony is all the prophets, from Moses to John the Baptist, leading up to the one true King, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, the Savior of not just Israel, but the Savior of the whole world. So I hope that helps you to frame these stories of the prophets in a slightly better way, and happy to chat more through the course of this series. Thank you. Goodbye.